The summer evening air hung thick with humidity as James pulled his car into the driveway of his childhood home. At 28, he hadn't expected to be back here, but his father's sudden 6-month business trip overseas had left his stepmom Diana in need of help. Though they'd never been particularly close during his teenage years, James had matured enough to recognize family duty when it called. The front door opened before he could even grab his bags from the trunk. Diana stood there, her auburn hair tied in a casual knot, wearing a simple sundress that caught the golden hour light. At 45, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had weathered life's storms and emerged stronger. "James, thank goodness you're here," she called out, waving enthusiastically. "I was beginning to think you'd changed your mind." He smiled despite his exhaustion from the 5-hour drive. "A promise is a promise, Diana. Dad asked me to check in on you while he's away, and honestly, I could use the break from the city anyway." Diana helped him with his bags, chatting about neighborhood changes and home improvements as they entered the house. The familiar scent of lemon cleaner and vanilla candles brought back memories, though much of the decor had changed since his mother's time. "I've set up the guest room for you," Diana explained. "Your old room became my office when the event planning business took off. I hope that's okay." "More than okay," James assured her. "I'm just glad to see you doing well with the business." Diana's smile faded slightly. "Well, about that, there's something I wanted to discuss with you. Maybe after dinner?" James nodded, curiosity piqued by her sudden shift in demeanor. He settled into the guest room, unpacked his essentials, and tried to ignore the strange feeling of being both at home and not quite belonging. Dinner was a simple affair of pasta and salad, with Diana asking polite questions about his architectural work in the city. James noticed her distraction, the way her eyes occasionally drifted to the clock, her fingers tapping nervously against her water glass. "So," he finally said, setting down his fork, "what's this thing you wanted to discuss?" Diana took a deep breath. "I have a favor to ask, a big one. I wouldn't normally put you in this position, but I'm desperate." "You're starting to worry me," James said with a small laugh that did little to mask his concern. "My event planning business is struggling, James. Your father doesn't know how bad it's gotten," she confessed, her voice dropping. "This economy has been brutal on luxury services, and I've lost 3 major clients to Elegant Affairs." James leaned forward. "Elegant Affairs, the new company downtown." "Yes. And they're undercutting everyone while somehow delivering incredible events. I've got one last chance at a major contract, the Hartman Brooks wedding. It could save my business, but I need inside information on what my competition is offering." The doorbell rang before James could respond. Diana jumped up, smoothing her dress. "That's Nick," she said, hurrying to answer. "Nick? My Nick?" James asked, surprised that his best friend from college would be showing up unannounced. Moments later, Diana returned with Nick in tow. Tall, charming, and sporting his trademark easy smile, Nick crossed the room to embrace James. "Man, it's good to see you. Diana said you'd be coming to town this week." James shot a questioning look at Diana, who had the grace to appear slightly embarrassed. "I may have reached out to Nick last week," she admitted, "because my request involves both of you." "Both of us?" James echoed, increasingly confused. Diana gestured for them all to sit at the kitchen table. "Next weekend, Elegant Affairs is hosting a pre-wedding event for potential clients. I need to know what they're offering, their pricing structure, their special touches. You need spies," Nick finished, grinning. "Exactly," Diana said, relief evident in her voice. "I need you two to pose as waitstaff for the event. The catering company is hiring temporary help, and I've already arranged interviews for both of you tomorrow." James stared at his stepmom in disbelief. This was the shocking request. Corporate espionage via catering? "Diana, this is," he began. "Brilliant," Nick interrupted, his eyes bright with excitement. "I'm in." James looked between his enthusiastic friend and his desperate stepmom. Diana reached across the table and took his hand. "Please, James, I wouldn't ask if I weren't out of options. This business is all I have now, with your father gone so much." Something in her voice, a vulnerability he'd never associated with his capable, independent stepmom, made the refusal die on his lips. "Fine," he sighed. "But if we get caught, I'm blaming Nick's bad influence." 3 days had passed since James agreed to Diana's unusual plan. The interviews with the catering company had gone surprisingly well, with both James and Nick securing spots for the upcoming event. Now the three of them sat around Diana's dining table, papers spread out in organized chaos as they prepared for Saturday. "Here's the layout of the venue," Diana explained, pointing to a detailed floor plan. "The main displays will be here in the Grand Hall. That's where you need to pay special attention." James nodded, studying the map while trying not to notice how the evening light caught in Diana's hair as she leaned forward. He'd been surprised by how quickly he'd fallen into an easy rhythm with her, so different from the polite distance they'd maintained through his college years and beyond. "What exactly am I looking for?" he asked, forcing his attention back to the task at hand. "Pricing sheets, exclusive vendor relationships, special techniques. Anything that gives them an edge," Diana replied. She looked up, catching his gaze with unexpected intensity. "I know this isn't entirely above board, but I've put everything into this business, James." Nick, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Your dedication is impressive, Diana. Most people would have given up by now." Diana's cheeks colored slightly at the compliment. "Giving up isn't really in my nature," she said with a small smile. "When I commit to something, I see it through." "Like when you married Dad?" James asked before he could stop himself. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Diana's eyes dropped to the table, her fingers fidgeting with the corner of a document. "Your father and I," she began, then paused. "It's complicated. But yes, I made a commitment." Nick cleared his throat. "I think I need some air. Mind if I step outside for a minute?" Once he'd gone, James turned to Diana. "I'm sorry, that was out of line." Diana shook her head. "No, it's a fair question. Your father and I have been growing apart for years. This business trip is just the latest excuse for distance." She looked up, her eyes surprisingly clear. "But that's not your burden to carry." "I never really gave you a chance, did I?" James admitted. "After Mom died, I was so angry at the world, and when Dad brought you home 2 years later, you became an easy target." Diana reached across the table and briefly touched his hand. "You were a teenager who'd lost his mother. I never held that against you." The casual touch sent an unexpected warmth through him. James had never really looked at Diana as a person separate from her role as his father's wife. Now, seeing the determination in her eyes, the slight worry line between her brows as she fought to save her business, he was discovering a woman of surprising depth. The back door opened as Nick returned, bringing with him the scent of night air and citrus from the garden. James noticed how Diana's expression brightened subtly at his friend's return, and felt an odd twinge of something he couldn't quite name. "I've been thinking," Nick said, sliding back into his chair. "We should practice how to serve properly. If we look like complete amateurs, they'll spot us immediately." Diana laughed, a genuine sound that filled the kitchen. "I was just going to suggest that. I actually have some serving trays we can use." They spent the next hour in an impromptu training session, Diana demonstrating the proper way to hold trays, serve drinks, and navigate a crowded room. Nick proved naturally adept, while James fumbled repeatedly, spilling water on himself to Diana's amusement. "Here, like this," she said finally, moving behind him and gently adjusting his arm position. Her presence so close sent a surprising jolt through James. He could smell her perfume, something light with hints of jasmine, and feel the warmth radiating from her body. Nick watched them with an unreadable expression. "You're a good teacher, Diana," he said quietly. Diana stepped back from James, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I've planned enough events to know the difference between good and bad service." As the evening progressed, James found himself watching the dynamic between Nick and Diana, how she laughed at his friend's jokes, how Nick's eyes followed her movements around the room. There was an ease between them that made James both happy and strangely unsettled. When Nick finally left for the night, promising to return tomorrow for more planning, Diana walked him to the door. James stayed behind, gathering papers, but through the window, he caught a glimpse of them standing close, talking softly. Nick reached out and briefly touched Diana's arm before leaving. James turned away, confused by the hollow feeling in his chest. This plan of Diana's was creating connections none of them had anticipated, and he wasn't sure where it all might lead. Saturday arrived with clear skies and a knot of tension in James's stomach. As he adjusted the black bow tie of his waiter's uniform, He caught his reflection in the mirror and barely recognized himself. The last time he'd worn something this formal was at his father's wedding to Diana 7 years ago. "Stop fidgeting," Diana said, appearing in the doorway of the guest room. She wore a simple black dress, her hair pulled back in an elegant twist. She would be attending the event as a potential client, maintaining a careful distance from James and Nick while they gathered information. "Easy for you to say," James muttered. "You're not the one balancing champagne trays in enemy territory." Diana stepped forward, reaching up to straighten his bow tie with practiced fingers. "You'll be fine. Just remember what we practiced." Her closeness made his pulse quicken unexpectedly. These past few days had revealed a different side of Diana, resourceful, funny, vulnerable in ways he'd never noticed before. Working closely with her had shifted something in their relationship, though he couldn't quite define what. "There," she said, stepping back to examine her handiwork. "Perfect." The doorbell announced Nick's arrival. Unlike James, he looked completely at ease in his formal attire, as if he'd been born to play the part of sophisticated server. "Ready for Operation Wedding Spy?" Nick asked with a grin. Diana laughed. "Please don't call it that, especially not at the event." The Hartman Historical Hotel was an impressive building, all marble columns and crystal chandeliers. The elegance of the venue made their mission seem even more daunting as they approached the staff entrance at the back. "Remember," Diana whispered before they parted ways, "the main display is in the Grand Hall. That's where they'll have their pricing and package information. And be careful." The next hour passed in a blur of training instructions from the catering manager and frantic preparation. Before James knew it, he was circulating through the crowd with a tray of champagne flutes, scanning for familiar faces and trying to appear like he belonged. He spotted Diana across the room, chatting with a well-dressed couple, looking every bit the potential bride's mother shopping for her daughter's wedding. Their eyes met briefly, and she gave an almost imperceptible nod before turning back to her conversation. Nick, meanwhile, had somehow charmed his way into serving the main elegant affairs table, where the event coordinator was showcasing their premium packages. James had to admire his friend's natural ability to blend in while gathering exactly the information they needed. As the evening progressed, James made his way toward the lavish display of photo albums and information packets in the Grand Hall. He was refilling glasses nearby when a familiar voice made him freeze. "James, is that you?" He turned slowly to find Melissa, his ex-girlfriend from 3 years ago, staring at him in surprise. "Of all the people to run into tonight." "Melissa," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "What a surprise. Are you working here now? I thought you were an architect in the city." Her voice carried just enough to draw attention from nearby guests. James felt sweat beading on his forehead. "Just helping out a friend tonight." "What brings you here?" "My sister's getting married. We're shopping venues." She looked confused, clearly wanting to continue the conversation. James was searching for an escape when Diana suddenly appeared, slipping her arm through Melissa's. "You must be related to the Hartman bride," Diana said smoothly. "I've been dying to speak with someone from the family about their experience with elegant affairs." As Diana gracefully pulled Melissa away, she shot James a pointed look over her shoulder. He took the hint and retreated toward the kitchen, heart pounding. He was arranging desserts on a tray when Nick slipped beside him. "I got it," Nick whispered, discreetly showing a folded paper tucked in his sleeve. "Complete pricing structure and their supplier list. Diana's going to be thrilled." The way Nick said her name, with a hint of warmth that went beyond their mission, caught James's attention. Before he could comment, the catering manager approached, and they quickly separated. The event ended at 11, and it was nearly midnight when they reconvened at Diana's house, adrenaline still coursing through their systems. "You two were amazing," Diana exclaimed, kicking off her heels and pulling out the pins from her hair. James watched as it fell in soft waves around her shoulders. "Nick, that supplier list is gold. And James, the way you handled that run-in with your ex was so smooth." "Only because you swooped in to save me," James admitted. Diana smiled, her eyes bright with excitement. "That's what partners do, right?" The following Tuesday, Diana's living room had transformed into a war room of sorts. Large poster boards displayed comparison charts of prices and services, with sticky notes marking competitive advantages. In the center of it all stood Diana, hair tucked haphazardly behind her ears, a marker in hand as she analyzed the final details of her presentation. "I think we're ready," she announced, capping the marker with a satisfying click. "The meeting with the Hartmans is tomorrow at 2. James looked up from his laptop where he'd been working on the visual slides. "These numbers look good. You're offering more personalized service at a better price point." "All thanks to my 2 corporate spies," Diana said with a smile that lit up her tired face. "I couldn't have done this without you both." Nick, who had been unusually quiet all morning, finally spoke up. "You did all the hard work, Diana. We just provided the intel." Something in his tone made James glance over. His friend was watching Diana with an intensity that seemed new, or perhaps just newly noticed. Either way, Diana continued, oblivious to Nick's gaze. "If I land this contract, it puts my business back on solid ground. I can finally stop losing sleep over bills." "You haven't been sleeping?" James asked, suddenly concerned. Diana waved away his worry. "Nothing a good cup of coffee can't fix. Speaking of which, anyone want another round before the final push?" As she disappeared into the kitchen, James turned to Nick. "You okay? You seem distracted." Nick ran a hand through his hair, a gesture James recognized from their college days when his friend was wrestling with a difficult decision. "Just thinking about how impressive Diana is. She's facing down this business crisis with so much grace." He paused. "Your dad's a fool to spend so much time away." The comment hung between them, loaded with unspoken implications. Before James could respond, Diana returned with 3 steaming mugs. "Final check on the presentation order," she said, oblivious to the tension. The next day passed in a blur of anticipation. James and Nick waited at the house while Diana met with the Hartmans. When she finally returned, her expression gave nothing away as she slowly closed the front door behind her. "Well?" James prompted, unable to bear the suspense. Diana's serious face suddenly broke into a radiant smile. "They signed. 3-month contract with option to renew for the full wedding package." The room erupted in cheers. Nick swept Diana into a spontaneous hug, lifting her slightly off the ground in his enthusiasm. James watched as she laughed against Nick's shoulder, her hands gripping his arms, their faces close when he set her down. Something shifted in the air between them, a moment of recognition that made James's chest tighten unexpectedly. "This calls for a celebration," James said, breaking the moment. "Dinner's on me tonight." They chose an upscale Italian restaurant downtown, one Diana had mentioned wanting to try. The excitement of their success, combined with rich food and flowing wine, created a warm atmosphere of accomplishment and connection. "To the best team a girl could ask for," Diana said, raising her 3rd glass of wine. The alcohol had painted pink spots on her cheeks and loosened her usual reserve. As the evening progressed, James noticed how the conversation flowed easily between Diana and Nick, how they leaned toward each other when speaking, their laughter in sync. He found himself watching Diana in a new light, not as his father's wife, but as a woman in her own right. The realization was both uncomfortable and strangely compelling. After dessert, as they waited for the check, Diana's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and her smile faltered. "It's your father," she said to James, rising from the table. "I should take this." James watched her walk toward the restaurant entrance, phone pressed to her ear. Her posture changed as she spoke, becoming more rigid, more formal. "They don't talk much, do they?" Nick asked quietly. James shook his head. "Dad's always been absorbed in his work, but it seems worse now." When Diana returned, the brightness in her eyes had dimmed. She slid back into her seat and took a large sip of wine. "Everything okay?" Nick asked gently. Diana attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Fine. He's extending his trip another month. Business complications." She said the words with practiced neutrality, but James could hear the hurt beneath. "I'm sorry," he said, reaching across to briefly touch her hand. Diana's fingers curled around his for a moment before she pulled away. "Don't be. I'm used to it. Besides," she said, forcing lightness into her voice, "I have my business to focus on, and apparently 2 new assistants who are surprisingly good at corporate espionage." A week after winning the Hartman contract, the atmosphere in the house had subtly shifted. Diana threw herself into preparations, often working late into the night. James found himself watching her more carefully, noticing the moments when her smile would fade when she thought no one was looking. Nick had become a regular presence, stopping by each evening after his consulting job, offering help that Diana increasingly relied upon. His marketing background provided useful insights for her business strategy, and their easy rapport was impossible to miss. One evening, James returned from a grocery run to find Nick and Diana sitting close together at the dining table, heads bent over a tablet. They didn't notice him immediately, and James paused in the doorway, struck by the comfortable intimacy of the scene. When Diana laughed at something Nick said, touching his arm lightly, James felt an unexpected pang of something he wasn't ready to name. "Hey," he called, announcing his presence. They looked up, Diana pulling back slightly from Nick. "James? Perfect timing. We're just finishing up the vendor contacts for next week's planning meeting." Later that night, after Diana had gone to bed, James and Nick sat on the back porch with beers in hand, the summer crickets providing background music to an increasingly tense silence. "I need to tell you something," Nick finally said, his voice low and serious. "And I'm not sure how you'll take it." James took a long pull from his beer. "You have feelings for Diana." Nick's surprised expression confirmed what James had already suspected. "How did you?" "I have eyes, Nick." James set his bottle down with more force than necessary. "I've seen how you look at her." Nick ran a hand over his face. "I didn't plan this, man. It just happened. Working with her these past weeks, seeing how amazing she is." "She's my stepmother," James said flatly, though the label suddenly felt inadequate to describe the complex woman he'd come to know. "She's also a woman who's been practically abandoned by her husband," Nick countered. "Your father hasn't called her in days, James. Not even to congratulate her on the contract." The truth of this statement hung between them. James had noticed his father's increasing absence in Diana's life, the way she would check her phone less and less frequently for messages that never came. "What are you planning to do about it?" James finally asked. Nick shook his head. "Nothing. She's still married, and you're my best friend. I just needed you to know." The next morning, an unexpected tension filled the house. Diana seemed to sense the shift between the friends but didn't pry. She kept her distance from both men, focusing intently on work calls and emails. By afternoon, the strained silence became unbearable. James found Diana in the garden, clipping roses with more force than the delicate flowers deserved. "Are you okay?" he asked, approaching cautiously. Diana looked up, her eyes suspiciously bright. "Fine, just fine." She snipped another rose, dropping it into her basket. "Your father called. He's thinking of extending his trip again." James sat on the garden bench. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." Her voice was tight. "It's been heading this way for years. I was just too stubborn to admit it. Is there someone else?" Diana laughed without humor. "I don't know, maybe. He's certainly not here, is he?" She set down her shears and sat beside him on the bench, their shoulders almost touching. "Can I ask you something, James?" He nodded, suddenly aware of the jasmine scent of her perfume. "Is it terrible that I sometimes wonder what it would be like to start over? To find someone who actually sees me?" Her voice trembled slightly. James thought of Nick, of the way his friend looked at Diana with genuine admiration. "No," he said softly. "That's not terrible at all." Diana turned to him, vulnerability plain on her face. "Nick makes me feel that way sometimes. Seen." She looked down at her hands. "I know it's complicated. He's your friend, I'm your stepmother. It's all wrong. Is it?" James found himself asking, surprising them both. Diana's eyes met his, searching for understanding. "I would never do anything. I respect your father, our marriage. But feelings don't always follow the rules," James finished for her. As they sat together in the fading afternoon light, James realized that his opposition to Nick's feelings wasn't just about loyalty to his father. It was fear of change, of his family shifting into something unrecognizable. And perhaps, though he could barely admit it to himself, a hint of something more complicated where Diana was concerned. The call came on a Thursday evening as they were finishing dinner. Diana's phone lit up with James's father's name, and the table fell into sudden silence. She excused herself, taking the phone to the privacy of the back porch. Through the window, James and Nick could see her pacing, her free hand gesturing occasionally, her shoulders progressively tensing. When she returned 10 minutes later, her face was composed but pale. She picked up her wine glass and took a long sip before speaking. "Your father won't be coming home next month as planned," she said to James, her voice carefully neutral. "He's decided to take on another project. He'll be away at least until Christmas." Nick glanced at James, concern evident in his expression. "Diana, I'm sorry," he said gently. She shrugged, the casual gesture at odds with the tightness around her eyes. "It's fine. More time to focus on growing the business, right?" But her attempt at lightness failed as her voice caught on the last word. James reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "What did he actually say, Diana?" She met his eyes, and for a moment her composure cracked. "He said he needed space to figure things out, that we've been growing apart for years." She took a shaky breath. "He mentioned divorce, James. Not directly, but it was there between the lines." Nick stood abruptly. "I should go. This is family. Stay," Diana and James said simultaneously. An awkward silence followed, broken when Diana laughed softly, a sound tinged with both sadness and something like relief. "I think we're well past pretending this is just a normal family situation, aren't we?" The truth of her words hung in the air. Over the past few weeks, the three of them had created something that defied simple definition, not quite family, not quite friends, but a connection that had become increasingly important to them all. Later, after the dishes were cleared and more wine had been poured, they moved to the living room. Diana curled into one end of the sofa, looking smaller than usual, more vulnerable. "I should have seen this coming," she said, staring into her glass. "Robert and we've been living separate lives for years. Even when he was physically here, he wasn't really present." Nick sat in the armchair opposite her, his gaze steady and supportive. "That doesn't make it hurt any less." She looked up at him, a small smile touching her lips. "No, it doesn't." James watched the exchange from his position by the window, suddenly feeling like an outsider. The connection between Nick and Diana was palpable, a current of understanding and attraction they'd both been trying to ignore out of respect for existing boundaries. "I think we need to talk about what's happening here," James said finally, drawing their attention. "Between all of us." Diana set down her wine glass. "James, I would never." "I know," he interrupted, "but ignoring it isn't working anymore." Nick straightened in his chair. "If you're uncomfortable with me being around, I understand. Your loyalty should be to your father." "My loyalty," James said carefully, "is to the people who are actually present in my life. Dad made his choice when he extended his trip without even discussing it with his wife." Diana's eyes widened slightly at his words. "The truth is," James continued, "I've been confused by all this. Watching you two grow closer, seeing Diana in a new light myself." He trailed off, not quite ready to articulate the complexity of his own feelings. "What are you saying?" Diana asked softly. "I'm saying that whatever happens between you and Nick, I won't stand in the way." The words cost him something to say, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Nick leaned forward. "James, I would never do anything to hurt our friendship. You know that, right?" James nodded, though a knot of complicated emotions tightened in his chest. "I know." Diana rose from the sofa and crossed to where James stood. She took his hands in hers, her eyes searching his face. "Thank you," she whispered, "for understanding, for not judging me." As she embraced him, James caught Nick's gaze over her shoulder. Something passed between the men, an acknowledgement, a promise, a line being redrawn. That night, lying awake in the guest room, James listened to the quiet house and tried to make sense of his tangled emotions. His father's marriage was likely ending, his best friend was falling for his stepmother, and somewhere in the midst of it all, James had found himself caring for Diana in ways he hadn't anticipated when he first arrived. The future stretched before them, uncertain but somehow ripe with possibility, as if they all stood on the edge of a new beginning none of them had planned for. 3 months passed, transforming the world outside as summer faded to autumn, and the first hints of winter appeared in the morning frost. Inside Diana's home, even more profound changes had taken place. James stood by the kitchen window, watching as Diana directed the caterers setting up in the backyard. Today was her 46th birthday, and despite her protests, he and Nick had insisted on a small celebration. Her business had flourished after the Hartman contract, bringing in 3 more major clients and allowing her to hire an assistant. She looks happy, Nick said, joining James at the window. James nodded. She does. The divorce papers had arrived 6 weeks ago. His father had been surprisingly forthright in his letter to James, admitting to an affair with a colleague overseas and expressing his hope that Diana would find the happiness she deserved. The revelation had stung less than James expected, perhaps because he'd already begun to see the marriage through Diana's eyes, a connection that had withered long ago. The flowers look great, James commented, gesturing to the arrangement Nick had selected for the center table. Thanks for not making this weird, Nick said quietly. I know it can't be easy. James turned to his friend. The tension that had existed between them had gradually eased as they found their new equilibrium. Nick had been respectful, taking things slowly with Diana, never pushing beyond the boundaries of what felt right to all of them. It's not what I expected when I came here, James admitted. But I've seen how you look at her, how you listen when she speaks. That's more than my father ever did. The back door opened and Diana stepped in, cheeks flushed from the cool air. The setup looks perfect, she announced. Though I still think this is too much fuss for a birthday. It's not just a birthday, James reminded her. It's celebrating everything you've accomplished this year. Diana's expression softened. I couldn't have done it without both of you. The evening unfolded with a gentle warmth that belied the season. A small gathering of Diana's friends and business associates filled the backyard with conversation and laughter. James observed from a distance as Diana moved among her guests, confident and radiant in a way he'd never seen before. Your stepmother is quite something, remarked Lisa, one of Diana's friends who had been watching James watch Diana. She's not my stepmother anymore, James corrected automatically. She's Diana. The simple statement felt right. Diana had evolved from an obligatory family relationship into someone who mattered to him on her own terms, a transformation that mirrored his own growth over these months. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, James found himself alone with Diana in the kitchen, loading plates into the dishwasher. I have something for you, he said, pulling a small wrapped package from his pocket. A birthday gift. Diana smiled, wiping her hands on a towel before accepting it. You didn't have to. I wanted to. She unwrapped it carefully to reveal a delicate silver frame containing a photo of the three of them, James, Diana, and Nick, taken at her first major event after winning the Hartman contract. They were laughing, arms linked, faces lit with shared triumph. James, she whispered, touching the glass gently, it's perfect. I know it's not a conventional family photo, he said. But then, we're not exactly conventional, are we? Diana looked up, her eyes shining. No, we're not. But maybe that's better. Nick appeared in the doorway, carrying the last of the glasses from outside. His eyes met Diana's, and the connection between them was palpable, respectful but undeniable. I've been meaning to tell you both, James said, suddenly sure of the decision he'd been contemplating for weeks. I'm thinking of taking that architectural contract in the city. It's only an hour's drive, but I'd have my own place again. Diana's expression showed understanding. You need your own space. We all do, James agreed. But I'll still be close enough for Sunday dinners. The three stood in the warmth of the kitchen, the bonds between them reshaped but stronger than before. Outside, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, dusting the world with the promise of new beginnings. Diana stepped forward and embraced James, whispering thank you against his shoulder, for his understanding, his acceptance, his role in helping her find this unexpected happiness. As he returned her embrace, James realized that family could be redefined, that love in all its forms could find new expressions when given the freedom to grow. When Nick joined their embrace, completing their unconventional circle, James felt not the loss he had once feared, but the expansion of something valuable, a connection that had begun with Diana's shocking request and evolved into something none of them could have anticipated, but all of them now treasured.